We know the machine exists. You see it, you use it, every day. It follows us, envelops our patterns. It hides behind the pillars and swings from the beams, weaving through the architecture of your mind. At times it waits in the shadows, while also becoming blatantly apparent. It doesn't ask for much, until it does. Then it consumes, runs rampant, and removes rational reasoning. It erodes character instantaneously and forces the machine learning. The machine only cares for you when you care about it. So that's why I feel it's important to try and understand it, to try and decipher the Columbian Exposition of 1893 and its role in the American machine. Let's begin. The American machine is what we're looking at today. There are many moving parts and intricate systems, some connected and others seemingly operating on their own accord. If this machine was capable of great accomplishments, gained overwhelming power, the power of ideas, of culture, of pure authority or force, could it be controlled, steered towards certain goals, pushed upward progressively, or folded into the sediment of empires that preceded it? I propose that this event is a catalyst for a media-industrial complex that will evolve into an essential piece in this machine. The last couple of episodes briefly explored the idea of manipulating the subconscious of those attending, creating a brand for the machine that would in turn create ideal citizens that would not only run and maintain the parts, but defend the machine itself should it be required. We begin with exploring a work by Gustave Le Bon, a French psychologist, who published a leading work in public psychology and sociology only a couple years after the Columbian Exposition came to a close. The Crowd, a study of the popular mind, was published in 1895 and explores various characteristics of crowd psychology. This arrived on my radar from a comment on the last video, mentioned through teaching the idea of branding, marketing, and sales. They noted a man named Edward Bernays, who some may be familiar with. He was considered the godfather of public relations, or what was known formally as propaganda. Here's the comment, and it goes through multiple levels, specifically mythos, ethos, and telos. Take a look if you have a moment, it's definitely worth a read. And in saying that, one of Edward Bernays' influences or inspirations was this work by Gustave Le Bon. Back on track here. The Crowd is a fascinating look at the inner workings of people when involved in large crowds. Groupthink. Anyone living through the last 5 years or so should probably be able to recall some prime examples of how people behaved once they became part of a certain group, a certain side. Again, this idea of, if you're not with us, you're against us. I'll set the stage here for why it's important to reference this work in relation to the exposition. We have Le Bon, who describes this time period as one which is in flux. It is a chaotic period in which the power has shifted from traditional policy of European states, which very rarely accounted for the opinion of the masses. Truth be told, it rarely mattered at all, yet Le Bon describes this transitional period as the era of crowds.
Today it is the traditions which used to obtain in politics and the individual tendencies and rivalries of rulers which do not count, while, on the contrary, the voice of the masses has become preponderant. It is this voice that dictates their conduct to kings, whose endeavor is to take note of its utterances. The destinies of nations are elaborated at present in the heart of the masses, and no longer in the councils of princes.
In essence, it seems that crowds must not just be dismissed or ignored, they must be addressed and managed. For if they are not, they can truly become the downfall of any civilization that has had their strength of morals deteriorate to a point of being unrecognizable. Le Bon discusses how the loss of these cultural, societal, and moral ideals will eventually lead to this unconscious and brutal of crowds, known simply as barbarians. In reality, and what our records show, is that civilizations are only ever created and directed by a small intellectual aristocracy, never by crowds. Le Bon further states that crowds are only powerful for destruction, and personally I only believe this is half true, and there is always the other side of humanity, where in chaotic events humans can band together for a common good, will rise and complete heroic tasks. One of the ideas explored is that of the psychological crowd, a gathering of people or individuals with no real distinction between any type of demographic could generally be explained as a crowd. Yet Le Bon points out, from a psychological point of view, there is a difference. Depending on the circumstances and the individuals, an effect is created. The sentiments and ideas of all the persons in the gathering take one in the same direction, and their conscious personality vanishes. A collective mind is formed, doubtless transitory, but presenting very clearly defined characteristics. The gathering has thus become what, in the absence of a better expression, I will call an organized crowd, or if the term is considered preferable, a psychological crowd. It forms a single being, and is subject to the law of the mental unity of crowds. And now we have an idea of what may have been employed at the Columbian Exposition of 1893, creating and developing an event that was meant to be visited, explored, investigated. The scale and grandeur allowed for the masses to gather, to combine, and to become saturated with this very effect, to become part of the American machine through the psychological crowd. The exposition itself was considered an educational endeavor, reflecting America's newfound prominence, with millions converging to participate, see technological wonders, and appreciate achievements. It was indeed known as the People's University, subtly guiding visitors' subconscious about their place and position within a larger context, while experiencing it all in the psychological crowd, where individual traits, thoughts, and even personalities may have been subdued in order to maintain a presence within this grand event. Do we really know this for sure, that this effect was employed or that this actually happened? No, not really. Suppose that is one for you to decide. Yet, let's really dive into some detail here. One aspect that is constantly revered about this event are the buildings, the architecture, and the ornamental details. Why harken back to old empires? Why include such detail, such grandeur? I briefly explored this in the last episode, stating it was directed to bringing forth the perception, crushing reality, that those empires of old are no longer vast distances away. They are here. It is now us, projecting a future of scale that was scarcely known or even seen before. So does this classical architecture have the same subconscious effect? Let's explore this idea. There's a video by a channel, the Nordic Symposium, on beauty and architecture, and there's a presentation by a Brandon Rowe, who is an assistant professor of architecture. He presented at an event called Beauty and Ugliness in Architecture, which took place in Oslo, Norway. I'll link it below for reference, yet here are some of the main takeaways in relation to the Columbian Exposition. The talk centers around the creation of a program that is drawing on principles of classical architecture. This specific presentation was called Beauty and the Brain. It begins with two images. One on the left is a more modern building, on the right a more classical one. He begins with a story of going through architecture school, and his professor mentioned how the image on the left was good architecture, while the image on the right was bad architecture. You see, there was a time not too distant in our past that the roles were reversed. There was a peculiar shift that happened, and ultimately would be almost impossible to isolate. Yet there was an individual named Adolf Loos who wrote an essay in 1908 titled Ornament and Crime. It argued the following: ornament is bad for society. Simplicity is good for society. Pretty simple. Not only bad, but Mr. Loos felt that those clinging to the past, intricate details were the stragglers of our society, slowing down progress, even stating not only is ornament produced by criminals, but also a crime is committed through the fact that ornament inflicts serious injury on people's health, on the national budget, and hence on cultural evolution. Not only is this detrimental to your personal health, he goes on later in the essay to state, even greater is the damage done by the ornament to the nation that produces it, since ornament is no longer a natural product of our culture, so that it is a phenomenon either of backwardsness or degeneration. The work of the ornamenter is no longer adequately remunerated. He continues with stating, since ornament is no longer organically linked with our culture, it is also no longer the expression of our culture. The ornament that is manufactured today has no connection with us, has absolutely no human connections, no connection with the world order. It is not capable of developing. Adolf considered these ornamental details to be primitive and pleasureless, even wasteful, a burden on society at large. This work was essentially a crusade against more decorative styles in favor of simplicity. It gained popularity among other architects, such as Ludwig Miles van der Rohe, who famously linked architecture with the principle less is more. Minimalist design, which in turn facilitates simplicity and functionality. Now, it does seem that this idea was adopted and influenced much of the later 20th century design philosophies. All of this to say that there is literature and various voices that perpetuated this idea of simplicity, and it's pretty clear which direction was taken during the latter half of the 20th century. From here, Brandon Rowe explores the idea of how architecture affects health and well-being. Just like Adolf Loos stated that ornament has a direct effect on the health of individuals. Could the opposite be true? And what if ornament didn't actually cause negative effects, but positive ones? Brandon goes on to discuss beauty. What was beauty and how it is associated with architecture, culminating with the old saying of beauty is in the eye of the beholder, where now new data is revealing that beauty is actually within the brain. That beauty is often sought when the emotional brain requires nourishment, the experience of pleasure, reward, and desire. That ornament detail, and even difference from patterns that are more simplified, create this effect, naturally seeking out patterns of proportion and harmony. The best encyclopedia we have of this concept is obviously nature herself. So do these fractal patterns found in nature affect us? He goes on to explain how nature is considered a statistical fractal, while exact fractals are patterns usually found in art or architecture, stating that humans usually prefer lower statistical fractals, or less complex, while when it comes to art or architecture, the general consensus is more exact or more detailed, more ornamental in design. Then explaining how viewing more abstract or non-fractal designs has actually been indicated to increase stress, while viewing natural fractal imagery decreases stress. From here, discussing what ornament is and sourcing a few authors who argue that ornament, or even particular aspects such as columns, are the principal ornament. The specific details can adorn various places and be placed in multiple combinations. Ultimately, these details, this ornament, creates beauty. It nourishes something inside us. So the question then is for you: have you felt a sense of awe, of beauty, of wonder, of something otherworldly going into these structures, viewing these structures? looking at the detail, the ornament upon ornament. Personally, I know I have. So then why was Adolf Loos so convinced of the opposite? And why was this direction pursued with such veracity? At least it seems that way. Robert even presents this idea from Leon Battista Alberti, who wrote the 10 books of architecture, that if the buildings are built of such beauty, it could disarm an enraged enemy. It will prevent him from offering it any injury. So if our buildings are beautiful enough, we will not have a desire to destroy them. Is this true? I certainly believe there's validity to this idea, possibly even more, due to using more durable materials. We then explore the idea of ornament having a narrative function, being put into categories, symbolic or possibly allegorical being the first. Secondly is mnemonic, or a memory device, a remembering of a specific event or person or idea. Lastly, aesthetic, simply just decor or beauty. We are going to take this next quote from Brandon's presentation and then tie a few points into the exposition here. This one is from Karsten Harries, from The Ethical Function of Architecture. It reads, "From now on, I shall call decoration that articulates a communal ethos, ornament, and decoration that we experience primarily as an aesthetic addition to building decoration. So understood decoration is the aesthetic analog to ornament." What this is saying simply is that decoration looks good, while ornament actually means something. Therefore, my proposition that the Columbian Exposition used this classical architecture to invoke this meaning, this reaction that has enveloped myself and many others, is a recognized phenomenon. It is a narrative itself. I would also like to tie in that comment mentioned before once again, talking about marketing, sales, and advertising, and specifically stating that they taught these topics through the lens of mythos, ethos, and telos. Again, it's an excellent comment and would recommend giving it a read in context to this event if you have not. And if you are watching, just a message directly to you, please correct any information I may misunderstand here in the following. So, they go on to write the following about ethos. Ethos, which equates to credibility and trust. Ethos in corporate branding refers to the company's character, authority, and trustworthiness. A strong ethos is crucial for building consumer confidence and loyalty. You know what they say, it takes 20 years to build a reputation and 5 minutes to destroy it. We then have a small breakdown of those 3 concepts, which I will read for full effect here, and let's even relate them to the exposition if possible. Trustworthiness. A company demonstrates reliability through consistent quality, transparent practices, and ethical conduct. Brand messaging should emphasize expertise and the ability to deliver on promises. We see within this event that the ability to deliver on the promise of a brighter future, a grand future, one that rivals empires of old and is shown through the sheer magnitude of the project itself. It may be an attempt to deliver on the promise of the American empire, the American dream even. Authority. Establishing a brand as a leader or expert in its industry. This can be achieved through certifications, endorsements, positive customer reviews, and highlighting years of experience. We see that American technology, business, architecture, and almost every detail in between reeks with authority. The scale of the grounds, the grandeur of the buildings themselves, the abundance of ornament that brings forth the narrative of ascension. We see the technology displayed that will assist the ascent into a world power, into its rightful position. The endorsement is the event itself. The customer reviews are the bewildered customers or ideal citizens being formed subconsciously. America is not just part of the world, it is the machine itself. The American machine. Next, we have reputation, the overall perception of the brand in the market. Ethical business practices and corporate social responsibility initiatives significantly contribute to a positive ethos. I described branding as a reputation within the last episode. All of the elements converge into this one aspect, which is assembled by the customer, the ideal citizen. You don't need me to tell you the overall perception of the Columbian Exposition. I'll just repeat what I said before. This event induced the same effect as in 1893, the same effect that has kept me delving into this topic after 15 plus episodes, the same effect that has kept you watching. Now back into Brandon's presentation here, we have this quote from Stephen Semmes within the publication The Architecture of Classical Interior, which states the following: "It is virtually impossible to invent a new system of ornament, just as it is virtually impossible to invent a new language. Ornament works like grammar, its forms drawing life from the repetition and subtle variation while remaining grounded in memories and recognizable models." This one quote actually kind of blew my mind here. It really made me think, is this why these details, this ornament has been used forever, I guess, in a sense? I mean, maybe the reason we see this type of architecture worldwide is due to it being a universal piece of beauty. The styles may differ subtly, slightly, however, the foundation of these elements remains the same. They work on principles that are geometrically and naturally ancient. It's a thought-provoking idea here. Why reinvent the wheel, so to speak? We have this set of ornament that becomes a triangular Venn diagram, where it overlays usefulness, beauty, and strength, or the function, the aesthetics, and the structure. This combination that allows for an optimal and overall beneficial way to create places for any desired purpose. Now back on track here. Later in the presentation, there is a unique section where eye tracking software is used to indicate where the eye moves when viewing both classical and modern architecture. What seems to happen is that with the more complex and fractal aspects of classical architecture, not only does it hold your attention for longer, there is a flow of attention, soaking up the entire structure as your vision moves from one aspect to another. Basically, they found that there was a statistically significant relationship between the complexity level and visual attention of these more ornamental structures or architecture. He then posits the most poignant question, and one which I will ask you now. If this is ultimately true, and maybe before even asking this question would be a primer here, to think of any structure, architecture, interior of grandeur that you have visited, that you have experienced. Did it have any effect on you? Capture your attention, draw your eye upwards and throughout the various detail? I have a subtle feeling that you may have had one of these experiences, that this ornament, these details, have had an effect due to their precision, their geometry, and their proportions, and thus its overall beauty. Therefore, is ornament really a crime like Adolf Loos suggested? Or is it actually criminal to design a building without ornament? What's interesting is Mr. Loos eventually wrote a couple decades later, after this modernist approach was being considered and pursued. And he kind of said, well, maybe you guys took it a bit too far here. This whole ornament is crime deal. even stating classical education has created, despite the differences of language and frontiers, a common Western culture. To abandon it would be to destroy this last common ground. It is for that reason we should cultivate not only classical ornament, but also the orders of columns and moldings. And what a curious thing to hear in our modern era. Maybe this was simply the transition of ornament to modernist architectural thinking. Or maybe the shift was a more directed approach, an intentional change, to shift the mentality of a populace ever so subtly into submitting to the idea that what came before was excessive. It was too harmful for the feeble populations, an ornamental assault on the mental health of residents, and, for me, and maybe you as well, the assault on creativity is an ongoing battle. The bombardment of the human spirit and creative output seems to be under constant pressure. It may be more of a natural pendulum that spans centuries and swings back and forth, or it could possibly be induced and held by artificial forces. Either way, one aspect that certainly contributes towards this facet is the media industrial complex. So we are diving back into a report by a familiar name here, Camille Krantz. If you've been following this series, his work has been referenced before. He is a French polytechnic engineer who published multiple volumes of reports and illustrative atlases from the Columbian Exposition, and they were published in 1894. We will review one final aspect before getting into the finale, so to speak. That is the rise of the mass media machine in the United States, an essential piece in the American machine. Mr. Krantz initially explores the expansion of the publication statistics, including charts which indicate how many books were published in which year and even sorts them by genre. We have some charts showing a more modern representation of book production, and it begins to fluctuate. Krantz explains that this is not necessarily due to less readership, but to the influx of other mediums into the American reading space. Let's read through a few sections that describe this. Newspapers and magazines. The newspaper industry is perhaps the most extraordinary thing in the United States. It is regrettable that it was virtually unrepresented at the exposition. The number of newspaper publishers who are classified in America in the same category as book publishers is enormous. Every city has its newspapers, all of which print numbers unknown in our departments, and offer their readers a number of pages next to which our meager European rags would pale in comparison. Magazines are just as widespread as daily newspapers, and we have already observed that in the United States, magazines are read far more than books. One only has to peruse Harper's Monthly, Century, Scribner's Monthly Magazine, and so many others to realize what these literary journals are. As for scientific journals, they are in no way inferior to the former, and in a country where labor and raw materials are quite expensive, one is astonished by the relative low cost of these journals. Fashion magazines occupy a large space, though less so than the magazines for young people, which are so well illustrated and so attractive. There are also a large number of technical newspapers and journals, all of which have a considerable readership, whether they deal with art or industrial arts, technology, commerce, agriculture, electricity, medicine, or sports. One of the most widespread is Scientific American, which deals primarily with discoveries and research touching on all aspects of human knowledge at every level. And here we're looking at a section named Printing. Printing in the United States has reached a level of development that is bound to surprise us. Whether it concerns newspaper printing, and we have seen the powerful resources available to them with machines like Hose, or the printing of luxury books, the triumph of American machines is undeniable. The United States is perhaps the country with the most printing houses, all generally well equipped. They work quickly and efficiently, both in terms of print runs and printing, and in all the processes used for illustration. And skipping ahead to this section here, we read, Printing machines. The machines exhibited in Chicago occupied a vast space. Those intended for printing were mostly of American manufacture. What is sought above all in America in these machines is speed, to produce the most in the least amount of time. Elegance takes a back seat. Only practicality is valued. So we can see that the American printing machine is geared not only towards speed, but vastly superior in range of mediums. We get this next section discussing typesetting. This was an exceptional find as it ties in perfectly with episode 8 of this series, discussing the 8th wonder of the world. Let's see what Krantz has said about typesetting in America. Typesetting machines. At the exposition, typesetting machines called linotypes were much admired. And here we have a brief section explaining them in a bit of detail. And if you're truly interested in this machine, you can go to my episode, which is episode 8 of this series, and encourage anyone to do a bit deeper research on this engineering marvel. Anyways, moving on. As you can see, this is a far cry from the old method of taking each letter separately from its case and manually placing it on the composing stick. The advantages of the linotype are numerous. It is very easy to learn to use. The operator is both typesetter and printer. Dispensing becomes unnecessary and is done automatically without the slightest error. The typefaces do not wear out from printing, since each new composition is, so to speak, printed on new type. The speed of typesetting is indeed undeniable, since a skilled operator can type 5,000 letters per hour. The one we saw at the exposition claimed to be able to type 6,000. A man named Smith, employed at the Commercial Journal in Toronto, typed 370,000 letters in round numbers in 1 week, or about 7,700 letters per hour. Perhaps this should be taken into account in this fact of American exaggeration. Now, I'm just going to read that again because I would like you to take note of this. It will be relevant in the last section of this presentation. Perhaps this should be taken into account in this fact of American exaggeration. Reading on here. Newspapers are the main users of the linotype. Since it is possible to compose lines of indeterminate length, it has been possible to type volumes, especially novels, reports, address books, and catalogs. For the latter, as well for the address books, there is certainly an advantage to using the linotype, because with all the lines being movable, these kinds of publications can easily be kept up to date without too much expense, but its use has not yet become widespread for books. So here we can see that the linotype was indeed a revolution not only for publishing of books, but mainly for the absurd increase in production of newspapers. So do recall when it was mentioned that any negative press could literally be drowned out. This is the reason why. Some papers published every day, some multiple times per day. This type of mass media was essentially unheard of earlier in the century, and was no doubt a technology that was seen to be incredibly valuable. One final section to read through here on lithography that I felt was poignant to the increased production. Reading through a few sections here. Color lithography is very widespread in the United States. It is represented by large firms that do great business. Their clientele is primarily in the railroad companies for their illustrated timetables, printed in fabulous numbers, print runs that are constantly renewed. In addition to this clientele, they produce wall posters, which reach sizes we cannot imagine in France. Another branch of industry provides the lithographic printing press with an enormous amount of business. Posters. They were very poorly represented at the exposition, and anyone who had been content to examine what they could see in the American section would have had no idea what posters are like in America. They play such an important role that we must say a few words about them. The poster, as we use it, does not date back to a very ancient era. One could say that it is a completely modern invention, and that the way it is presented to make an impression on the passerby has a characteristic quality that differs from one culture to another. Thanks to lithography, posters have been given considerable and ever-increasing reach. It was France that first gave the poster the artistic flair it has attained in recent times. However, the Americans have surpassed us. American posters have only one goal: to strike suddenly and make themselves understood without requiring the slightest effort from the mind. They are therefore composed with a rare spirit of observation, suggesting a perfect knowledge of the most effective means. Designed to attract the attention of the crowd, the main subject is prominently displayed and absorbs everything else. The text matters little in a country where activity is so all-consuming that passers-by don't even have time to linger and read an explanatory text. The latter often appears at the bottom of the posters or on a separate strip. In the United States, posters play a dominant role, and some walls are covered with them. Theaters consume enormous quantities of them. They have a large number of copies printed every day and distribute them everywhere, in pharmacies and restaurants, especially in the former, where there is a constant flow of customers day and night. For the pharmacist, in addition to the pharmaceuticals and medicines, sells a multitude of goods and objects of all kinds: cigars, postage stamps, newspapers, and especially a variety of drinks, which are enjoyed at the corner surrounded by high stools. These posters are displayed in these establishments in exchange for complimentary tickets, and for as long as the play is running. One final section here. In the United States, paper consumption is equaled by few countries, not only for books but especially for magazines and newspapers. The printing papers intended for books and magazines are of excellent quality and very well manufactured. The pulp is very white, and their strength allows them to withstand the most rigorous calendaring without fear of damage. For illustrations, this is an advantage not to be overlooked. So overall here, we have this trifecta of different elements that aided the machine. The Columbian Exposition had access to them all. The event and fanfare all aided the crowd mentality, subtly guiding visitors through the various advertisements of the event, quietly nudging people to view and admire the vision of America imperialism, or just America in general. This was a renewed empirical vision, one that was aided by the grand and elegant display of ornamented architecture. For ornament, despite Adolf Loos and his essay, surely plays a critical role in how we view our buildings, our streets, our cities, and our society. Do we build for beauty? Do we build with intention? Or even consider structures that may last decades or centuries into the future? Using these details was no accident at the exposition. As the past two episodes alluded to, this display was meant to shatter perceptions. It clearly worked to some extent then, and has worked more so today. A bit of foreshadowing there. In tandem with an emerging printing press and system that was drastically outpacing the world and becoming a unique American industry of just straight up mass media production, with the added ability to manipulate or drown out certain stories or voices that may be unfavorable. Yet there was one sentence in this very report that may have landed a huge blow to my own hypothesis. It echoed the same chatter that happened before the opening of the event, which was published in the Book of the Fair in Volume 1. So this was in official documents of the fair, which is interesting. However, stating this was comments from foreign commissioners. I'm sure once we read through a few of these accounts, it will be pretty clear where this thread is going. So let's read. About this time it began to be noised abroad that to complete the buildings and their repairs, and to install the exhibits by the 1st of May, would be a task beyond the powers of the managers, said the Chicago correspondent of a leading San Francisco journal, writing from Jackson Park in February 1893. This seems to me an impossibility. To be sure, those in charge claim that they will be ready on time. Still, the cold-blooded fact stares one in the face that only the women's building is anywhere near completion, inside and out. Now, just before this note here that we read, It had described the collapse of a section of roof in the manufacturer's building, and this was highlighted in earlier episodes. So with the repairs and this specific note here being February of 1893, right? February of 1893. We are less than 3 months away, and this correspondent is stating that the only thing close to completion is the women's building. Let's read some more sections here. Same book, same volume. By foreign commissioners who had taken part in international exhibitions, it was declared some weeks prior to the 1st of May that to open on the date would not be possible. There were too many unfinished buildings, walls unplastered, leaky roofs, and the accumulation of debris. Moreover, on account of heavy snowfalls, followed by rain and thaw, the work of installing exhibits was delayed until long after the appointed time, and more than once suspended, those which were already unpacked being covered with tarpaulins, and thus preserved from injury. Such was the severity of the winter that the end of March drew near before this portion of the work could be thoroughly taken in hand. For this purpose, a special department was organized and equipped, one capable of handling several hundred carloads a day, and with many miles of track connecting the buildings with railroad termini. From dawn till dusk, and from nightfall almost until daybreak, the trains were running goods intended for the fair receiving the preference in right of way. If, as the opening day drew near, few of the departments were in presentable shape, if even for some time after the opening men spoke of the exposition as it would be, and not as it was, it was mainly due to the tardiness of certain exhibitors, many of whom would not even pay for the additional labor needed to install their wares. Moving on to the next page here, we read a few sections. In the transportation department, the roof had been seriously damaged by snow and ice, thus delaying the work of installation. In the horticultural hall, exhibits were rapidly being placed in position, and the space of those who could not be ready in time was transferred to other applicants. And so with the remaining departments, where, as one of their chiefs remarked, all objectionable features would disappear and all uncompleted groups be finished as speedily as possible. There was then at work an army of 40,000 or 50,000 men, under such discipline that all seemed to move with the precision of a military parade. Some were busied in cleaning the roads, in leveling roadways, and removing debris, others in gardening, and still others in finishing staff decorations or putting the final touches on buildings, with thousands of painters and carpenters at work, and with many additional thousands passing to and fro, on errands, on business, or acting as escort to visitors. Most striking of all was the endless procession of wagons and drays, approaching the grounds from several directions in lines a quarter of a mile in length, then under the direction of the Columbian guards, falling into other lines already within the park, and proceeding on their way with loads of materials and exhibits. In the opposite direction passed a similar line of empty vehicles, returning for new loads to the railroad depots. Inside the buildings, a second army was at work, unpacking and installing exhibits, some by hand and some must be lifted by derricks and wheeled on cars into place. Thus, if not completed by the 1st of May, the Columbian Exposition was in proportion to its scope and size as far advanced as some others of the great world fairs. Now listen to this next one here, this next sentence. This is an intriguing one. Never, since the London Exhibition of 1851, and seldom even at our state and county fairs, was the display in perfect readiness at the appointed time. How curious. And so that's basically saying all of these world fairs were not ready. They were never ready at the time that they were supposed to open. So then the question is, what are we seeing within the publications? And we'll explore that a bit later in the presentation here. But reading on. And now, after more than 2 years of preparation, after so much had been said and written concerning the great display, so much that was true, so much that was untrue. Its gates were about to be thrown open, that all the world might judge for itself how well or ill the work had been accomplished. What a final sentence for this book as we close out and move on to the next one. This event is like an onion, and we are slowly peeling back various layers to uncover the details that lie beneath. For it is this nuance, these details within the events themselves, that truly give a more understandable perspective and provide context. For example, even going through my previous episodes, just off the top here, episode 12 was Camille Krantz and his discussion about how the buildings were in, let's just say, poor condition. They weren't representative of, quote-unquote, the old world. Episode 13 was exploring various machinery, and we even have questionable numbers on the piles that were driven, and were they drastically overestimated for the foundational work, where only a few buildings required very small sections, and not dozens and dozens requiring massive sections. Episode 14, I explored if the grounds were largely completed, and the story of the swamp was more or less conjured to generate buzz and complete the story arc of Chicago and its heroic endeavor. And here we are with episode 16, going through the very same report from Camille Krantz discussing the publications and publication abilities of America and other countries. We have this brief little section, yet it is a sledgehammer in this regard. We read, on May 1st, 1893, the exposition was solemnly opened by President Cleveland, without, however, having the privilege of being more completely ready than its predecessors, because the interior installation, although carried out with prodigious activity, was only half completed on the date set for the inauguration. So again, just to reiterate here, that was from the earlier section in the publishing book we were just reading through, from the last segment, by Camille Krantz, the Polytechnic engineer that developed several reports on the event and its various aspects. He is stating that half of the interiors are not done. Considering the amount of buildings is usually a popular topic when discussing this event, it's incredibly revealing. Now, I also translated 2 other books and have collected some notes to present here. The first one is a French report, similar to the previous one, this one completed by a Mr. Ernest Laurdelay. I'm just going to go through all of the notes that I found interesting or relating to this type of detail, and let you decide. So, we read. Mr. Ernest Laurdelay. Arriving in Chicago on May 5th, he did not leave the city until July 12th. He devoted each day to the complete and meticulous examination of this great privately initiated enterprise. It was impossible for him in the state in which he found the work at the Palace of Manufactures and elsewhere. Nothing was ready. The harsh season had lasted very late. At the end of April, there had been a great deal of snow, and everything had been delayed. This melting snow had soaked the rutted and very soft ground of Jackson Park, and it was in the mud amidst potholes, materials, and scaffolding. Although the exposition it was solemnly opened on May 1st, and it was necessary to circulate. Inside, it was even worse. The only foreign sections truly ready were Switzerland and Belgium. The others were in the hands of carpenters, masons, molders, painters, etc. Display cases were being assembled amidst the chaos. The American administration fell short of expectations. The lack of method, precision, unity of action and direction, eagerness and helpfulness was recognized and felt by all. The Americans, in giving this exposition immense proportions, have shown an ambition that would be very noble and praiseworthy if the very exaggeration of this sentiment had not made them forget that they had invited all the nations of the world to this great competition and that they owed their guests aid, assistance, support, and even courteous attentiveness. The general appearance of the grounds at the end of May, when the gardens were not yet installed, when the outside galleries were still all cluttered with crates, planks, unpacking, and debris, was quite different from what it became in July. It is understandable that those who returned to Europe after the hardships of the initial installation days, those who knew nothing of the White City but mud, jostling, and the expectations and demands of the native staff, painted a bleak picture of this undertaking. Visitors were few, 20, 30, 40,000 a day. What is that for such vastness? Gilded papers, tin sheets, spangles, powdered bronze, etc., which form one of the main industries of Nuremberg and Fürth, are concentrated in a dark room that was supposed to be lit by electricity from the opening of the Palace of Manufactures. It was only on June 17th that anything could be seen, the American administration having taken 6 weeks to provide electric light inside the palace. 6 weeks to provide electric light inside the palace, although it did provide it outside in the evenings and in the electricity building. And so now this section is just discussing the United States in general and their exhibits within various places all over the grounds. The expositions in which this nation had participated in Europe have never allowed for an appreciation of its industrial development. At first, this section bordering Columbia Avenue and the Cross Avenue had no facade. But when the commission of the American section saw the monumental buildings erected in the foreign sections, it hastily had a storefront built to remedy the inadequacy of this series. Small, square, glass-fronted boxes with or without pediments of a depressing uniformity, made even more somber by the black hue adopted by the entire group of fabrics. People were exchanging opinions on the poor effect produced by this line of small, black, overly regular, and overly low booths when toward the end of June, an arcaded facade with gilded capitals and consoles seemed to rise as if by magic. It was only in the first half of July that this partition was covered with canvas and whitewashed, and one more pseudo-palace could be counted. Here we have a note on the Argentine Republic. This country was not yet fully set up on July 10th at that time. However, one could get a sense of what its exhibit would be like. This is July 10th. This is 2 months and like a week after this thing opened, and it is still not fully set up. Moving on. Perfumers such as Messrs. V. Klotz, Vassier, Regard, unfortunately they are located in a dark gallery where the incandescent lamps operate continuously, but they waited more than 2 months for them. During this time, they were in almost complete darkness. And this again is in the manufacturer's building. And here we have a quick note from the Pavilion of Anthropology and Hygiene. Built last, this pavilion had no architectural pretensions. It is rectangular in shape and has the appearance of a vast warehouse, constructed of wood and covered with plaster. Here we have a section just titled First Floor Musical Instruments. By a strange anomaly, the musical instruments of France are relegated to the first floor gallery of this palace. They should be in the Palace of Manufacturers, like those of other nations. The proximity of one of the Wellington restaurants makes this location particularly undesirable. And so here, I just wanted to note this because it's showing how things are not only uncompleted, but they are in just the wrong place. They're not in the designated area that they were stated to be. Moving on though, here we have a quick note from Brazil. Brazil, whose arrangement was not completed at the time these notes were taken, has a pyramid of gold and another of coal. So again, Brazil is in the same story as Argentina. Italy had not yet completed its installation. What could be seen was marble. Italy, same situation. Again, another indication from Brazil. It says Brazil has erected a veritable palace. On July 10th, its construction was not yet finished. Here we have one from Kentucky. Construction in this state was not completed until mid-July 1893. So again, mid-July. This is 2.5 months after the opening of the event, and this is a state building, the state building for Kentucky. Moving on, we have a couple other mentions here. Next comes the dairy, which was not in operation in July, but which was intended for the exhibition of all the apparatuses and accessories of this industry and for courses and lectures on the subject. So again, the dairy operation, not working in July, not ready. The stock pavilion, an immense elliptical, maybe just building, is also unoccupied. American authorities attempted to impose on European cattle for fear of contagious diseases. It is therefore empty, and the vast arena is only used by the cavalry of the British Army, who hold carousels and military tournaments there. Behind the stock pavilion are the livestock pens, also unoccupied. So those were all the details of note that I can find in this French report. And maybe there are more that would require a bit more digging, but those were the ones that I can find. Next, though, will be the official report from the Danish Exhibition Committee by the Commissioner General. And we'll do the same thing. I'll just read through the points that I've collected of note that relate to this type of detail. The attendance at the Chicago Exposition at the beginning of the exhibition period was not nearly as large as had been expected. This was partly due to the fact that the exhibition was perhaps as unfinished as any of the previous World Fairs when it opened, and partly to special reasons. The weather was very bad and sleety during the first part of the exhibition period, and anything but inviting for a visit to the exhibition. The means of communication between the city and the exhibition were not quite in order. Hotel prices in the cities were so high that they scared away visitors, and the exhibition authorities had not made sufficient provision for the convenience of the public. Everything that could bring in money was leased out, partly against very high fees, and in such a way that it strongly had the character of a monopolization. Further down, we read benches and chairs could at first only be used against payment, and were available in a completely insufficient number. So just kind of focusing on this aspect here, I did have a question. When looking through the imagery, we saw chairs and benches just almost piled up in these big collections. And is this why? Is that people actually had to pay? They had to pay money to buy benches and chairs so they could sit down. So they essentially held them in groups at a location for people to come up, pay money in order to buy a bench. Wild. Absolutely wild. Reading on here. Gradually, as the exhibition was completed, the deficiencies were remedied, and the exhibition authorities gained more control over providing entertainment for the public through concerts and the like. And this section here, I was going to save this to the end, but let's just get through this now. This is very, very intriguing. What we have here, I'll read the little section and see what you think, because anybody following at least my episodes or following this event in general will see the discrepancy. And we read, the total number of paying exhibition visitors from the opening of the exhibition in May to its closing in October amounted to the enormous number of 21,463,256 people, distributed as follows. And they even have a small chart going month by month. Now, isn't that interesting? Because the Danes, this Danish report, are stating that the numbers recorded for visitors is 21 million. Let's say 21.5 million. Let's just round it up a bit here. What was the number that the American press indicated? What's the number that's been regurgitated and parroted even in my own episodes, even on Wikipedia? And I'm sure if you're familiar with this event, you know this number. So isn't it interesting that it's not a difference by just a rounding error here? It is a difference of millions. Millions, folks. Millions. How curious. Reading on, though, we have a few more things to get through. When the exhibition was held to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Columbus's discovery of America, it was originally intended that it would take place in the Jubilee year itself, 1892. However, the many preparations that had to be made for the exhibition and the considerable construction work that had to be carried out immediately made it obvious that it would be impossible to complete it by that year. It was therefore decided to hold the exhibition in 1893, and to mark the Jubilee year, to inaugurate the exhibition park and the exhibition buildings in 1892. So just highlighting this because this is a common point that's stated that there was so much work to be done that it had to be moved ahead a year. And even with that extra year, it still seems that this was largely unfinished. Moving on. The interest aroused by the first announcements about its holding and the reports of the preparations that were made for it seemed to fall completely to the ground after its opening. This was contributed by certainly the unfinished state in which the exhibition was on opening day. The buildings were not completely finished, and the arrangement of the exhibits was, for most countries, the matter barely began on May 1st. The European press had sent representatives over to the opening of the exhibition. The impression they brought home had to be less than satisfactory and came to influence Europe's perception of the exhibition in a way that is unfortunate for this. It will not be difficult to point out both the shortcomings and the errors of the Chicago Exposition, yet no one who has really become acquainted with it will be able to deny that the enterprise, bold as it was in plan, was magnificent in execution, successful in result, and must undoubtedly be described not only as the largest, but also as the most magnificent of the world's exhibitions ever held. Few of these palaces, built with such enormous sacrifices, could really be said to be fully suitable for exhibition purposes. Their mighty dimensions and gigantic forms had an oppressive effect on the exhibits and even forced the nations participating in the exhibition to often erect very expensive frames around their sections. Moving on, we have a section about American crafts. Reading here. The Chicago Exhibition of 1893 has been the subject of very different opinions, and it was only towards its end that it found defenders in Europe. The European journalists who were present at its opening sent almost all unfavorable descriptions home, and these fell well in line with the distrust of the whole enterprise, which was quite common in the Old World. In America, and especially in Chicago, no mild words were used about these first European letter writers, who were rightly considered to have dismissed the great enterprise in a rather superficial manner. The exhibition was certainly not finished on May 1st, but all its external apparatus stood there in its full splendor and beauty. The Lord does not seem to have noticed it. Moving on, we have some notes for the Manufacturers' Hall. So the Manufacturers' Hall, what was lacking in this hall, however, was the fine execution down to the smallest details, which the French had achieved and which showed how they understood how to handle the task. One got the impression from the interior of the Manufacturers' Hall that the main aim had been to create a space that would so astonish the public by its dimensions that they completely forgot to look at what the room actually looked like. They had therefore not hesitated to deliver it, so to speak, unfinished, with rough wall surfaces and unpainted sections, even at very conspicuous points, while tasteless transitions from wood to iron in many places had a highly disfiguring effect. The lower circular aisles, which were divided by wide galleries, were thereby almost made impossible as exhibition spaces, and the exhibits that had been placed there saw as little daylight as they did the public. Just going for the jugular here. The main hall itself, on the other hand, was an excellent and impressive space, but even this was brutally ruined by a monstrosity of a bell tower, which was planted right in the middle and completely broke the magnificent perspective that the 50-foot wide central street would have offered, while at the same time, by its height and its proportions, it completely crushed the entrance portals of the neighboring countries. Moving on here, in addition to the aforementioned bell tower, the central aisle had another dubious ornament in an all too conspicuous place, namely a freestanding, flimsy, and unsafe-looking iron stand running from the floor to the hall to its top and containing a spacious elevator which with appropriate American speed moved up and down, each time filled with passengers. A sober European would immediately get the impression, at the sight of this, that to enter this variation of a captive balloon was almost tantamount to suicide. In front of the main entrance of this building was the large tribune, from which President Cleveland on May 1st, 1893, in the presence of a colossal crowd, by pressing an electric button with a golden key, set machines and fountains in motion, and thus declared the exhibition open, although there was still a good deal left to be completed at this, and not least in the American sections. So here we have ample notes of the incompleteness of this event, in tandem with Camille Krantz and his report mentioned in episode 12, which was pointing how these glorified sheds were essentially a poor representation of what was present in the old world. It was a valiant attempt, yet the Americans did not pull it off, not even close, by the sounds of it. Yet one of the most poignant notes was within that first book of the fair, which indicated that all the world's fairs fall victim to this. Since 1851 in London, these fairs have not been complete upon opening. So what we see are the remnants of the media industrial complex, the fragments that enable many to create elaborate ideas of what these events were, how they were completed, the fragments we are meant to see, machinations of simplicity. Only after this many episodes have I truly begun to unravel this event, so to speak. So what does that say for anyone having a casual glance at this and listening to a few open-ended ideas of what may have transpired? What these last notes show is that my hypothesis is being tested. Not only that, does it still even hold up? I've stated that this event was a psychological operation. It was proficient at capturing the mind's architecture through the inauguration of the media industrial complex, the coalescing of media interests into a behemoth that can collectively shape the process, its production, distribution, and consumption. This first is done through private companies and no doubt leaks into government. So it's a unison of state, private business, and then the national mouthpiece. The main issue here is that the fair's immaculate, immense, and impeccably decorated fair was a main argument of mine. Yet it seems that that would not be the case. There was so much unfinished, still being completed, still being constructed. Many of these details not completed until months later. And who truly knows if there was even more that was not mentioned? How can we truly tell what was completed and what was not? Therefore, was this event truly as powerful as I made it out to be? Suppose that will be up for you to decide. Yet, it was powerful, was it not? Because we are all here, not because we have the nuance discussed here, but because the machine works. Because we didn't have the nuance. Unless we really dig into these specific topics, it reveals that history is deeper, richer, more complicated and nuanced if you're willing to explore. It shows that the remnants of this event have continued to pay dividends to the machine, portraying a sanitized, story-like script that encapsulates events and histories. For that is one of the most human activities, certainly one of, if not the oldest, is storytelling. Through the last few episodes, I've discussed how the grounds may have been more finished or landscaped than what was originally mentioned. We have seen numerous accounts of how this event was not completed, at the time of May 1st in 1893. It was continually being worked on for months afterwards. We even have differing numbers on the attendance records. Again, that being more than just a rounding error. We are talking about millions in difference. This is the American machine. It shows that my hypothesis is, in all probability, both incorrect and correct. It would matter when in time we are viewing the event. Maybe like a fine wine, the effect has improved since the event and it lives on in its pristine form through the images and books we see today. Not necessarily of how it was during the time, but how it is perceived afterwards. This new data, at least to me anyway, leads to a few other intriguing questions or just ideas. I've always wondered why there were very few images of the interiors. There were many mentions in American publications that stated the interiors were as glorious, or even more so than the exteriors. So now we must take all of these statements with caution. Is this part of the machine? Are these statements bending reality to portray this event, this city, and America itself as something it may not have actually accomplished? Credit where credit is due. Many of these articles and statements do indicate that this event was indeed an exceptional World's Fair. It was certainly grand and ambitious, but it wasn't done. It wasn't even close. And it actually pains me to say this, because I pushed back against this idea in these videos and in comments. And there have been comments saying that this timeline was impossible for what was constructed. And in all honesty, I must concede with this info that those statements are probably correct. It may as well have been impossible, because from these accounts, it was not done. To be frank, we actually don't know what was done, and if what we see in the many publications is, in actuality, the end of the event. That would seem to be indicated by the increase in visitors by the end. Maybe by the time this thing was being shut down, it was finally being completed. Or maybe it was never quite completed. And to be honest, we would never get an inkling of that from American publication anyways. It would be amazing to get an account from a foreign representative who was there during the final weeks and get their perspective. Ultimately, what this final segment shows is that there is nuance with events like this. This type of data cannot be understood simply from slideshows and speculation. This investigation so far has been a humbling experience and has clearly knocked me down a few pegs. When I think I know, the very next episode throws a spanner in the works. Regardless of how well my hypothesis describes the manipulation of the time, the visitors of 1893, it will always and forever be lost to time. I can speculate and add data to aid my case, yet it is almost a bullseye for what is happening today with this event. It has reemerged and become this behemoth of speculation and endless theories, almost entirely based on imagery. Imagery that was carefully curated, manipulated, and controlled throughout the event. And just thinking out loud here, is this another point as to why photography was so controlled? To me, that would make much more sense. If this whole event was in shambles when it started, the city of Chicago, the organizers, and certainly America itself would not want such imagery showing an incomplete mess for the world to see. Written press could probably be more controlled, thoroughly controlled, let's say, even if it was just drowning out the competition with pure quantity or mass of publications. Would this aid the case of the increase or enlistment of the Columbian Guard too, a militia to ensure these types of details were not photographed? Speculation, yes. Suppose that's one for you to decide. Back to the imagery though. That imagery is where all of these ideas and theories arose from. The details we get from this event are the ones we've inherited. It shows that there is more to the story. There is nuance, and there is most certainly lies, or to be more diplomatic, a stretching of the truth. I would encourage you all to investigate more, to question even the questioner. For how many events, how many structures, how many people are judged purely based on the historical imagery? It shows that this type of surface-level investigation is only that, what lies on the surface. It is most likely what the machine has produced, and what the machine wants you to see. There is so much energy and time poured into accounts of the past that may have drastically different stories than what is presented. The American machine worked almost flawlessly for this event, over 130 years into the future. It captured myself and many others. This event is still a psyop. As mentioned before, these fairs seem to be a catalyst or a novelty spear that harpoons curious minds and captures their attention from the sheer shock of the event itself. The American machine at work, folks. How many stories have been created simply from looking at imagery and accounts left by the machine? Often what is required is more investigation, but don't take my word for it. Research yourself, click the links, actually investigate. It seems a more beneficial goal of this series now is to try and understand how these operations work at a deeper level, exploring different materials and including them into the larger framework, and potentially cross-referencing them with those that have explored this idea much earlier than myself. That is why we took a deeper look into ornament and into psychology within this episode. They are both separately intriguing topics that are linked to this exposition, and also intertwine with each other through narrative storytelling, using proportional beauty, an architectural language of divinity. At the end of the day, people will believe what they wish to believe. I'm not here to change minds or to convince you of one side or the other. This is data. This is my perspective, my opinion. When this series started, I thought there was a mystery of lost and veiled history to be found. Turns out that aspect was indeed true, but not to the extent that is parroted online. Grandiose and unsubstantiated claims that showcase the machine is still well-oiled and puttering along, capturing people like myself who are curious, who may think differently, and test the edges of reality once in a while. I am not exempt from this. However, I do stand with a solid few who can see this for what it is, an operation. The battlefield is here now. It's not only guns and trenches and armored behemoths. It's pixels. It's digital noise that gets interpreted millions of ways. It's a brand. The elements are there to be assembled, and those following the various ideas are putting pieces together. Is this really an authentic, organic movement anymore? Was it ever? Sure, it gets clicks, it gets views, and overall it gets money. And one of my favorite comments on this phenomenon is from Berserking History, that this sacred cow has turned into a cash cow. So the pressure is now applied. If one exposition is exposed, does that not put them all into question? In my opinion, with much more data to present, the Columbian Exposition has fallen from grace. The foundations of this cash cow are now on display. For now, the mechanism and its parts have been exposed. It subtly hums in the distance. The ornament rises. The psychology owned. It doesn't ask for much until it does. So, did it work? Suppose that's for you to decide, though. For me, it seems the machine is working as intended.